So welcome to the next in my kind of GM tip series. From the notes you can see on screen, I'm returning to the GMing style discussion we had a few weeks ago, purely because it, I believe, will help kind of focus the discussion I want to have today on emergent storytelling. And I'll get more into what emergent storytelling is swiftly, but as by now the established formula suggests, recap first. So with that in mind, last time my party assembled, we found them undertaking they volunteered to undertake a mission for the Knights Arcana in the fort, in the Shadow Fort, in the Shadowfell, or the Shadow Watch Fort. I can't remember what I called it in the end. And this was explicitly something that the Knights Arcana know is dangerous, so they couldn't ask them to do it. It had to be a volunteer thing. And essentially, the party found out that the creatures that were attacking the fort on their return to said fort after lighting the braziers were kind of people altered by the magic of the Shadowfell and by the unique unique kind of food and drink of the Shadowfell, and certainly in this area of the Shadowfell, in my world, the river, the river Lethe, if consumed, removes one's memories. So with kind of that knowledge and the knowledge that there is someone living in the caves at the foot of the cliff, somehow unifying the Saurus One and using them as a weapon against the Knights Arcana, the party proceeded to kind of investigate. And this was designed to be kind of an all-day session thing where they'd get to the dungeon, kind of go through the dungeon, and then we'd end at the boss to be played through at our regular Monday gaming session. And what do you know? It didn't work out that way, because it's D&D and players do what players do, and emergent storytelling at my table is king. So it took us 4 hours to get to the entrance of the dungeon, and that's great. There was a lot of role playing and character stuff, which is primarily why I do this kind of thing. So I didn't care, players didn't care, but essentially the players they stocked up, learned what little else they could, did some jobs on the side, and then headed off. A lot of the session was taken up by the fact that out of all of them, only one of them failed their constitution check to hold their breath successfully while crossing the river, and lost all his memories. That was, luckily, he has a patron as a warlock and a sorcerer, and the patron kind of interceded magically at a narratively appropriate juncture and allowed me to deliver some exposition and to keep the game progressing. They then explored the crumbling wizard's tower in the area, tried to steal something and alerted the guardian, defeated the guardian and successfully stole the wizard's staff, which is just a much depleted staff of withering, so it does 1 point of necrotic damage on a successful hit. And then proceeded into the dungeon, where, if you've seen any of these before, any of the archives up on YouTube, channel there's the same as the Twitch channel, Comrade Bubbles. They managed to get through 2 of the puzzle/traps I designed on stream. The first one took a bit longer than I expected, and in hindsight, the -1 from maximum HP when progressing to the next loop because my notes set called for every 2 loops, but it was just a lot of bookkeeping. So to simplify things, I moved it down to 1 loop. And at this level, that's a bit harsh. And in hindsight, I probably wouldn't do that again. I'd have maybe a condition effect. Also, even though the Sorcerer Warlock did sort of solve the problem, the puzzle, he didn't share the information he had. So there we go. I could have been clearer about the solution possibly, and better communication at the table, but live and learn. And they eventually managed to get through it, and then proceeded to explore and triggered the anger rune, for want of a better title. And this was a great example of emergent gameplay, and I'll be discussing it later on. But it took up the bulk of the session remaining after the first puzzle, and then that was just a lot of role playing that drew the attention of the staff at the cafe we play in, and kind of made me really proud of my players. So they're great role players and they're getting better all the time. And it's great to see that as someone who likes to introduce people to role playing games. And I've kind of watched them go from knowing nothing to being comfortable yelling at each other over a table in a cafe in public now. So that's great. Um, and then after that, their yelling did unfortunately attract the attention of a wandering monster. So there was a small pseudo random encounter um, using terminology that the game uses. And then we ended there. Players still have the Shrinking Rune and the kind of Belly of the Beast puzzle remaining, and then the boss. If there is time and their resources are still pretty good, I will probably throw another encounter at them, but I doubt I'll need to. I'll just use any kind of opportunities in the boss fight to maybe throw another monster into the scene. Not full health monster, it'll be weakened, but just to ramp up the threat level, start it as a single monster creature encounter, and then build up from there. So before discussing the impact of emergent storytelling on different GMing styles, what is emergent storytelling? And if you have any thoughts, comments, or whatever, put them in chat. I'm checking it. But for now, my understanding of emergent storytelling is running with whatever the players throw at you. Because as the GM, you can't prepare for everything, and you can only get a good understanding of what your players will do unless you're telepathic. What you bring to the table is obviously not going to be understood the same way by everyone, and having kind of a fixed idea of an outcome will upset some people because that outcome just won't occur to them. A good example is the River of Death puzzle. To me, that made sense, but to have a series of 7 bells and then if you're on the right loop corresponding to the position of the bell in numerical order, that bell glows. But that, in hindsight, I can see why that would not necessarily be clear to understand, and why my players struggled with it. Unfortunately, I kind of backed myself into a corner there because I didn't leave myself much leeway for clues or how to simplify the puzzle necessarily. So it's a lesson to take away from that. Always leave yourself room for clues if players are struggling to understand a puzzle. So you can't prepare for every eventuality. It's kind of embrace that and accept that things are going to come up at the table. Players are going to suggest things or kind of run with an understanding of something that you never prepared for, and that makes the game better in a way. Well, I was going to say in a way because that's just my way of speaking, but makes the game more collaborative. Obviously, there's among tabletop role players, there's a huge variety of GMing styles, and some people treat it like an author writing a book or a director directing a film, and the players are very much there um, to do what they want and to uh, tell the story that they want to tell. That's not how I want to play my games. Um, by now, if you've been paying attention to these streams, I'm very much more a collaborative storyteller. I want to help us all tell a great story. So I seed the bare bones of something and then let the players run with it. So uh, going back to the anger rune example, in previous streams and up on YouTube, what have you, um, I mentioned that I was thinking of having uh, so for context, um, it's a room that makes player characters irrationally angry and kind of they can't leave the room until they're not angry anymore, or they can't see the doors. So if you pass the wisdom check, you can leave fine. Wisdom save, you can leave fine. But if you are angry, unless you can no longer see the source of your anger, i.e., the room itself, you can't leave. And as I mentioned, I was thinking of having some sort of berserk condition where, and this has never progressed further than this, but I was thinking kind of player characters have disadvantage to attack everything, but they're using 5th edition terminology because that's what we play. To attack everything but the source of their anger. And I realized last Monday as we sat down at the table that that would just be a big PvP brawl, and that's not what my players want to do with their kind of characters in the mainline continuity. And I'd certainly be interested in hearing from people who kind of encourage that kind of PvP behavior. Um, but a few of my players have expressed interest in that, but as purely kind of a one-off side note session, kind of like um, level 10 battle royale situation. So I didn't really have a clear picture of what would happen at that puzzle trap, I suppose, technically. And this is where the emergent stuff comes in, because I just told my players that they were angry and suggested a source for that anger. And then they ran with it. And as I said at the recap, they got stuck in. They were yelling at each other. They were kind of highlighting character defects. The party rogue, who so they've all got extra kind of magical abilities because of the theme of the campaign. The party rogue dropped a darkness spell that only he and the sorcerer could see through because he's a shadow sorcerer, which immediately kind of allowed everyone but them, if they could find the door, to leave the room and then kind of cancel the effects of the spell of the anger. But while the three that can't see through magical darkness were kind of stumbling around the room, um, the warlock and the rogue were both confronting their insecurities about who they are as people and what they've done in the past. Sorry, the sorcerer and the rogue. And that's a great bit of improvisational role playing that certainly I would never have expected, and you can't really plan for, but highlights how emergent storytelling can, improve a game. In this instance, it's just through character development and, well, I guess primarily character development, but also in intra-party relationships and allowing people to figure out where their characters stand in relation to other characters in light of new information. But for the sake of structure, how does emergent storytelling and its pros and cons weigh in with the kind of the established GMing styles I talked about a few weeks ago? Well, obviously prepared. It's I'm not going to reread the summary. You can actually, I suppose, for dyslexic people and things like that, for accessibility reasons. So prepared GMing is where you prepare the material in advance. It's less reliant on improvisation and random encounters, and it means you have all the information at hand when you need it, but sometimes there is too much information, and if it goes wrong by, say, you can't remember something and you need to check your notes, or you missay something, you misspeak, and then realize afterwards I need to retcon something, it can break the immersion of the game. So obviously emergent gameplay is, well, emergent storytelling is not ideal in this situation because by its very nature it's improvisational, it's chaotic, it's unpredictable. You can't define where an emergent event is going to end up, even though you can usually define where it's going to start using this framework of GMing. And if you are a GM who prefers to prepare material in advance and have kind of reams and reams of notes and spend hours preparing, one, good for you. I do that occasionally. It's very enjoyable. So I can totally see why you do that. But two, just let me know how you feel about dealing, if you kind of almost exclusively prepare stuff, let me know how you feel about dealing with emergent events at the table. So for structure, in terms of pros and cons, it can enhance the game. That's not how you spell enhance, you idiot. You fool. By allowing the players a feeling of agency. And what I mean by this is that it means that the players will feel like they're at least partially in control of their characters, more than they might necessarily otherwise do. I've noticed that a lot of people who kind of fall into the author slash director approach to GMing tend to come across as way more prepared and kind of having a lot of pre-established material close to hand, which sometimes can take away from the feeling of player agency. Kind of you're just following along with the GM and what they want to tell you, rather than being able to have your own say in the direction that the story takes. But on the flip side of that, let's always press the wrong button, the wrong key, sorry. On the flip side of that, of course, it means the campaign can leave your prepared area. And obviously by this, I just mean that an emergent event, whether it's something that a player doesn't fully understand and so has kind of a false idea of what they should be doing, or something a player says in character that sparks another player, and then they kind of snowball from there, can lead the game in a direction that you haven't prepared for, and so you might not necessarily be as comfortable with. And obviously that's a problem if you prefer preparing for games and you aren't comfortable improvising. And I feel it's something I haven't said enough, but improvising isn't for everyone. It is a skill that you can learn, and there are certainly loads of resources out there to help you learn. But at the end of the day, kind of if you do prefer to, prepare in advance and you don't like the feeling of being out of control that improvisational gameplay brings to the table, then obviously the game might flounder a little. And something, I guess, because this isn't really how I approach games, so the only advice I can really give, if you want any, is to kind of explain to your players that they've left what you've prepared and you need a moment to think of, to prepare stuff for them to do. Something else you might be able to do change the wording on a few things, move things around. Players, unless you tell them so, will rarely know when something's gone wrong. Um, Certainly, I've had a lot of instances where, kind of behind the scenes, I've been panicking, but one, I have a good poker face, so the players have no idea how scared I am inside of screwing things up royally. But two, um, it's not really self-confidence, but it's, I guess, a willingness to see where things will go once it's off script. And something I would be actually, I mean, obviously, I'm interested in hearing feedback on all of this, but something I would love to learn is how many people actually start with this kind of over prepared, well, not over prepared, but extremely prepared mentality and approach to GMing, and then gradually relax from that. Because that's certainly what I did. I used to create detailed plans of kind of NPCs, scenes, treasure tables for each level or kind of quest within a level, and then kind of use that to dictate what the players did at the table. And then I just slowly moved away from that to the point where I am now, which is what I've spoken before, where it's kind of a lot of my middle ground approach, most of the game being improvised with vague story beats plotted out and just having that prepared list of NPCs and locations. That was a digression. I apologize, but I hope it was useful at least, or thought-provoking. Um, right now, in interest of saving time, I can't think of any more pros and cons. Yeah, I can totally see that. I am sorry, YouTube responding to chat. Uh, I do that a fair amount. I have a Trello board set up with a list of NPCs and their relationships to each other, um, kind of organized by location, and I haven't formally written it anyway, but I have got a good idea of the world state. I will admit that I over prepared the history of the world and realized that all the work I did, the players would never really see. It's useful for me to know if they have those questions, but equally, I like the flexibility of being able to say X happened in X year and it to be true. And obviously, I can't speak for you, but I once I've written something, kind of I have to stick to that because that's just the way my mind works, and it's really annoying. And I can ignore it, but it takes a lot of kind of effort to then go back and change it, um, because I feel like I'm being untrue to myself, which is stupid, I know, but it's just the way my brain works. But certainly that's the approach um, I take. So thank you for sharing. Uh, I will respond, of course, to chat at any point. For now, I'm going to. Ooh, yeah, asking questions about the history of the world certainly does, and kind of the repercussions certainly does help with revealing a game. I know that I sort of did that backwards in that I wanted. So for context, because I believe you're new here, um, my game was set up for people who are completely new to role-playing games and in a kind of a public environment. So I wanted something that was very low pressure for them. So I kind of went with established tropes and things like that, and then put my own spin on why they were that way. So I knew I wanted kind of a mega city, uh, kind of like Ankh-Morpork, but on a massive scale, where everything could be found within the city. And I also wanted an area of the same country to be very much more kind of dots of light in the wilderness. and kind of as part of that worked out use that to inform the world history in a way. So I had the mega city and then loads of fortified villages essentially, just because of that was just differing approaches to the same problem of monstrous creatures. And while I tried to share that with my players, obviously, I say obviously, you're new here, I think. So my players haven't really left the starting city, even though they're now level 6, which is not a problem per se, although they have said they want to explore more. But it's just been a constraint of kind of everything I did at the start of the game to help ease them into role-playing games in general by having a far more guided approach to kind of quest structuring. Um, as context, they're all members of the city secret police. They're all members of this world's equivalent of the Harpers. For those who don't know the Harpers, it's a society of essentially people who will do whatever they have to maintain, to help the poorer peoples of the world and to look after the people of the world from the Forgotten Realms in D&D lore. So I gave them 2 quest-giving organizations just so it was structured enough for them to get to grips with the system before branching out, and it's just taken a lot longer than expected to get anywhere because I use milestones rather than experience leveling. So I hope that kind of gave my context for things. But definitely asking what the history of the world means to the world does help and can inform the direction of the game, which is actually what's happening right at the minute with one of the, I say side quests, but one of the, I don't really have side quests anymore. I just have quests that weave in and out because the bad guy's doing something in the background that is impacting the players sometimes. Because I want the players to have the story that they want to have, but obviously there is an antagonist in the background who has his own goals. And certainly at the minute that this kind of quest that they're on at the minute, quest thread, I guess, having a ruined city in the world and kind of what that means for the rest of the country is great because I have a lot of leeway to say that kind of criminals run to this area because it's a ruined city full of undead and they can hide there, although obviously it's extremely dangerous. But and this is what I've been trying to do with these streams and what have you, and what the website I run. Just trying to vocalize or put down in writing how I approach things and why I approach things that way. And then the person in Twitch chat just says it far better than I ever could. So thank you. Yes, so as I say, I'll keep monitoring Twitch chat, but I'm going to progress on to the next section of On the Fly, which is something I know a lot of my friends do. And this is something I very much do in kind of one-shots or shorter games. It's just complete lack of preparation. Everything is improvised. Means the game is fluid and yes, can get out of hand easily, but at the same time, well, it's the purest expression of emergent storytelling. And it means there is no safety net and in-world consistency. Sorry, no safety net of prepared material. And in-world consistency can suffer if you misspeak and kind of run with that for a bit and then misspeak again accidentally and what have you. But I've lost my mouse cursor. As I said, this is the, to me at least, the purest form of emergent storytelling. Purely because kind of it's just rolling with whatever happens at the table. And while this is great for player agency, Kind of same problem as actually, I mean, really, the same problem's going to crop up all along. Um, it can leave you floundering if you're not as comfortable with improvising. Um, and this is more a thing for the middle ground, so I'll drop it down there. It can leave you wrong-footed, and what I mean by that is more that you struggle to come up with a response and then misspeak or do something that damages player immersion or consistency. And obviously, a huge part of, certainly the way I see it, a huge part of the GM's role is to own up to mistakes and to not be afraid to admit to their players that something was incorrectly stated or was misunderstood. Um, and I don't mean kind of minor things that have no real bearing on the world, but if it's something that you want to draw attention to, then obviously do what you feel comfortable doing. Um, for me, because I am a pedant, I will point out my own inconsistencies and flaws in storytelling to my players, and they'll never have noticed, and they don't care, but I care. Uh, as an example of this, and this I know is a digression, I apologize, but I had the players approaching a gate at night time, a fortified gate, during a coup, and because I don't overly prepare descriptions, I completely forgot that a gate in that circumstance would have guards on it. Players didn't notice there weren't guards on it. I don't think they necessarily assumed there weren't guards, but they just didn't question the fact that there should be guards. And it felt kind of, in my mind, I felt that that was a huge error, like a glaring, kind of obvious thing to get wrong. But they didn't care. At the end of the day, I was the only one that cared, and it did allow me to reintroduce one player character who player had to leave kind of that session after that session anyway, after rejoining for one game, and to introduce another player character. But owning up to mistakes, especially in such a collaborative effort, to me is quite important. But it's all about knowing which mistakes to own up to. And a lot of the time, as I say, they won't know that you've got anything wrong, and what you've got wrong won't necessarily um, impact the game in any way. Or, and this is the theme of emergent storytelling after all, um, if you get something wrong and it's better than what you thought or than what you intended to say or do or prepared, then kind of roll with it. I do this a lot. This is how my player characters ended up in the Shadowfell. Um, that's how I managed to get a lot of emotional blackmail over some Promethean characters in a game I ran a while ago. I mean, it wasn't intentionally emotional blackmail, but kind of um, it was a very good way of teaching the Prometheans themselves. For those who don't know, Prometheans are artificial beings created in the World of Darkness, or Chronicles of Darkness, I suppose it is now, and they're trying to become human. So I used a kind of a misstep to teach them about consequences and medical testing and the lengths that some people will go to learn about life by um, not really reintroducing, but having a lab full of cats, and the players just assumed they were the cats that they'd seen earlier in the game. and kind of I rolled with it, and as I say, it gave the scene emotional weight and taught the characters themselves about humanity. So that's how a mistake can improve a game. But equally, if you feel like the mistake has not ruined the game but worsened it, totally admit to that. Do what you feel comfortable doing to kind of rectify it without being overly heavy-handed or dictatorial or um, kind of accept the limits of a retcon, I guess. So apart from being left wrong-footed um, when improvising everything, the trouble with discussing emergent storytelling and improvisation, an entirely improvised game, I should say, of course, is that they're kind of one and the same thing, and so the drawbacks of one are the drawbacks of the other, but it's kind of doubling down on that in a way. So I think the easiest way of summarizing any drawback would be just to see above, or um, I guess this style's drawbacks. And then the middle ground approach, again, is mostly improvised, but you have the prepared material. As I mentioned earlier, I have a Trello board of locations, NPCs in that location, kind of NPC relationships in that location, general idea of the political climate of that location, and then as discussed, I think in the first of these streams, the the thing I borrowed from Fate with kind of each location having 3 aspect descriptors to help solidify it as a fantastical location that is memorable in and of itself, or to help me maintain narrative consistency, descriptive consistency. Uh, and then obviously things like random dungeon generators to help spark creativity and improvisation without being overly prepared. I'm using one of these at the minute for the dungeon that my players are going through, and again, it's helping with emergent storytelling. Um, the dungeon I generated. Ooh, yes, exactly. Um, I've so for YouTube's benefit, just responding to post and chat. Um, the everything's kind of built along 2 main trade routes, and the when I say country, the political structure is very much kind of a lot of feudal is the wrong word. Sorry, it's been one of those days. Um, I've got it's a loose alliance of independent city-states in a way. Um, so the Scour, where the player characters are based, which is this mega town, and then there's the ruined city, which was another mega town in the heartlands of the country, and then on the far coast is essentially Venice, for want of a better descriptor. Uh, Sheermouth, built into the delta of a river, um, where kind of the seat of political power is, purely based on kind of non-aggression treaties and um, trading agreements and things like that. And then the fortified towns and stuff are based in the Ashlands, ruled by, and like very stereotypical fantasy names because that's the mood I was in when I was creating all of this. Um, Ruled from the Fire Keep, a city built into an active volcano and protected by magic. And then all kind of the towns in the Ashlands are built on this network of well well maintained and well guarded trade routes that allow for trade between the towns and food security. relying primarily on the fertile soil, because volcanic soil is incredibly fertile for anyone who is unaware, and also um, the fortified farms of Scour itself trade from the ruined city of Githranok, and from Sheermuth, obviously a bit more difficult because that goes through the Heartlands where there's no authority, there's no law, there's no kind of presence of any sort of protective force. So 100%, if a fortified town fell, it would be discovered fairly quickly, like a few days, I guess. And when the players kind of progress up there, if they decide to progress up there, then it will be very much a standing militia type place, and everyone within a reasonable distance of the event will know when something happens to the town 3 days away, for example. But yes, that is 100% accurate. And while I hadn't really considered the idea of food security, um, this is why I like collaboration and collaborative creativity. While I hadn't considered food security, that is 100% something I will bear in mind going forwards. So thank you. And if anyone at any point, obviously it's a bit harder in YouTube comments, but wants me to repeat something because I know I speak fairly quickly, uh, please let me know. I won't be offended. I also know that kind of I don't have a very inflected voice, so I apologize for that. Um, yeah, so going to the uh, putting it into practice section, and I should say after for people new to the stream, after I kind of cover everything, I do generally hang around on stream and in chat for a bit, but stop the archive recording for YouTube. So just a heads up that I'll be stopping that soonish, but then hanging around in chat for a little bit, maybe till about 3 my time, so half an hour or so. So putting it into practice, kind of really just accept it's going to happen, I guess, and develop. And for people who are watching this and wondering why I'm typing what I'm saying, it's an accessibility thing, or because some people may not necessarily kind of watch the whole stream or recording, and having the notes there obviously helps catch them up. So develop skills to cope with emergent storytelling, and even if that's just the confidence necessary to admit that you've done something wrong, or to say that you need that you need some time to think about what's going to happen as a result of this. Something that is, I guess, adjacent to this, develop good note-taking skills, because your players will 100%, almost 100%, suggest things you've never considered, or much like Bobicus in chat, raise issues with world building that I've never considered. And I hope I pronounced that correctly now. If it's something that you feel would enhance the game, or in my case, what the world building, kind of make a note of it so that you consider it in future. A good example of this kind of is when kind of just not hypothetical, but actual something that I've experienced. I talk to my players a lot about their character backstory and kind of what direction they want their characters to go in. So when a player in character establishes something new about their backstory that's never been discussed before, that I feel I can kind of weave into the game, either in the direction that they've told me they want it to go in, or um, the direction that I feel that the character is likely to go in, or that the player would enjoy the character going in. And again, oh, and again, um, and don't forget that even though you can ask your players what direction they want their characters to go in, people like being a lot of people like being surprised. I certainly do, and I don't imagine I'm alone in that. Well, no, I'm not alone in that actually, from talking to other players. Um, so if they say something in character that kind of sparks your creativity about something that can help them with, or about something that you feel will improve their character's story in the game, or another character's story, depending on how it, links. Um, Make a note of that and move on. And it doesn't have to be a detailed note, just a note that you can understand. And I guess for now, the final point would be reward creativity. I um, I'm certainly guilty of this, but I try and cheese everything through my player character abilities. Uh, so kind of way back when I started playing 5th edition, I think it was a few months after it came out, I rolled up a bard. I mean, I'm still playing the bard, but when she was, really low level, um, her whole shtick before kind of developing further was that she wanted to she wanted to kind of resolve conflict through words, not weapons. So she almost refused to use her weapons, and she wasn't a combat focused bard at that point anyway. Um, so my main attack strategy was get a flask of oil, throw it at someone, ignite the oil, and then use magic to kind of keep intensifying the flame. Obviously, that lasts only as long as the flame is there to burn, but my DM was lenient and allowed me to do that. And a lot of the time, as I've stated a lot over the past 47 minutes, players will surprise you and they'll think of stuff you never thought of, and it will probably be cool. I very much follow the rule of cool where it makes sense to. If it's game breaking, probably won't, but there have to be limits. Um, so if a player does have this really cool solution to something that you'd never considered, like my advice would be allow it. Obviously, if you feel it necessary to impose limits, clearly explain the limits to the player so that they don't have the wrong idea about what they can and can't do. But totally allow it and kind of enjoy enjoy their increased enjoyment of the game. But if another player is noticeably not as happy about it, discuss that with that player, find out what they did and didn't like about that solution. Um, it's important. It's important, certainly to me, that all my players are getting roughly equal amounts of enjoyment out of the game. And something that I guess anyone who's GM'd for a long period of time and who's GM'd for both newcomers and for experienced role players is that when newcomers are kind of shown that they can be creative and that they don't have to stick to the guidelines on their character sheet, um, they start being creative themselves and kind of developing their abilities at the tabletop and enjoying the game more, I guess. Also, something related to rewarding creativity, I guess. Um, Embrace the opportunities yourself. to add stuff on the fly. Um, what I mean by this is there was a video I watched ages and ages ago. I can't remember who by, but it was kind of if the player rolls absurdly high on a perception score, don't have them find nothing if there's nothing to find. Have them always find something. Um, perception or investigation in D&D terms, I guess. And even if that something doesn't matter to the game at hand, or to or has no effect whatsoever on the story or what's happening, um, just have something cool for them to find, because that might prompt later on down the line something awesome that you could never have scripted or plotted, I guess. And this is another instance where random dungeon generators are great, because certainly the one I use, Dungeons, it has, not for every room, but for some rooms, sorry, includes it includes treasure, which I largely ignore because my players have enough treasure right now. But it includes incidental details, like um, for example, one of the rooms in the dungeon my players are running through now, it just had "they ate barley" written on the wall and a key. And obviously the players may not do anything with that information. One of them took the key, so maybe we'll have a kind of a short story down the line of them trying to find out what that key opens. And until that idea is fixed, it could open anything. It's highly unlikely they'll find what it opens, but just through coincidence, but they might. Um, and this is 100% what I did by throwing them into the Shadowfell. I saw an opportunity to send the story in an interesting direction, one that I hadn't expected up until that point, but one I knew they'd have to travel to eventually, and used it as a learning experience for them. This is kind of like the tutorial stage of the Shadowfell, so that when they return in a few levels' time, tooled up, fully equipped, and actually ready for it, they know what they're doing and they know what to avoid and what they can and can't do. It also meant I could introduce things like alternative currencies. I took a leaf from Veins of the Earth supplement for Lamentations of the Flame Princess, and light is the currency in the Shadowfell. And the players, well, the rogue player, immediately started figuring out how he could break the local economy and create light to barter with. And this isn't what I intended to happen, but equally, I didn't have a clear idea of what was going to happen, so I didn't mind taking the chance on something new. And it worked out really well. They've enjoyed this kind of level, or they're enjoying this level, and having some great feedback, and obviously it's teaching them more about the world. And it got them out of Scour, which was important. But I think that's really everything. So moving, just quick summary. Um, Emergent storytelling, obviously, or according to my understanding of it, is the random things happening at the table that you could never plan for or predict, and rolling with it to improve the game. And if you do find something isn't working at the table, if you do find that kind of the same things keep coming up over and over again, then take a moment and figure out how you can address that fact. But embrace the opportunity for change and fluidity, if you're comfortable doing so. And that's, I guess, that's the greatest lesson to learn as a GM, certainly with the proliferation of online shows and GM tip videos, and something that I wanted to bring up when I first started this, and to my regret haven't so far, but finally getting around to it. Don't measure yourself by the actions of others. Do what you're comfortable doing as a GM, because certainly from my experience, measuring yourself up to someone else, someone who's had vastly more experience than I, and is far more confident than I in certain aspects, kind of really detracts from my enjoyment of GMing. And I live for GMing. This is like storytelling has helped me so much in terms of social skills, um, and self-confidence and things like that, that without it I would be a vastly different person. And being able to GM regularly as opposed to just one-off games has really helped me as a role player, and I'm hopefully using that to engage with you guys on Twitch and YouTube and through my website on WordPress to help to help bring new people into the hobby and to offer alternative points of view or inspiration and kind of a common ground for discussion. So yeah, just do what you're comfortable with. If you want to emulate someone and you aren't comfortable with how they do things, figure out what you are comfortable with and do it a bit at a time. And this is not really related to emergent storytelling in any way, I admit, but I feel it's something that needs saying and isn't said enough, certainly in what I've seen. Um, we are all the sum of our own experiences, and everyone's going to feel differently about different things. As I've mentioned previously, I can't really do voices. You can tell my voice isn't that, as I've said, inflected. I don't emote much through my voice. So voice acting in general is difficult for me, but I can do passable accents. Certainly, um, in the context of where I run my game and with my player group, everyone, I hope, knows that my aim is to be respectful of different accents when I attempt them. I never intend to offend or to parody or to stereotype. Um, but I have a knack for languages and for phonemes. So I do what I can to help improve the game for my players, um, to cover up for the fact that I can't voice act very well. But certainly that's something that I can practice and get better at, hopefully over time. So I found my comfort level, and then I'm just trying little bits every now and then to improve that comfort level. Um, so if you're not 100% comfortable with emergent storytelling and with allowing that kind of thing, find what you are comfortable with. It might just be allowing a player to suggest something that the party finds on a day of otherwise uninterrupted travel, or allow a player to describe an NPC in the scene. Little things that, yes, give players agency and give them some investment in the game beyond their own character sheet, but also something that helps with collaborative storytelling. Um, as I hope anyone who's stuck around for this long has ascertained, I feel that the point of view from Twitch chat has really helped me with, or has helped me to understand where my approach lacks. And um, obviously that's one of my mantras, and I feel it applies equally well to role-playing games as to any other facet of life, is you don't know what you don't know. And I never know what I'm not considering. I try to consider a lot, but I never know what I'm not considering, or it just doesn't occur to me to consider. And if you're feeling like your NPCs are all the same, or your travel scenes are lacking, or your kind of player characters are almost tropey, I guess, um, that probably won't be as much of a problem as the former two issues. But if you feel that there is an aspect of your game that is lacking in some way that you can't put your finger on, but you realize could be improved, allow the players to help with that. Or look up a random generator online, or kind of steal from literature or movies or other games for that matter. Um, Everything's fair game, you know, bad joke aside. I think that's everything I wanted to cover really. Um, Except that sometimes emergent storytelling is going to go wrong, or that you're going to be unprepared for what happens as a result of it, and put measures into place if you do get caught off guard by it. But I would 100% recommend kind of embracing it as a possibility at the very least, because as I've said many times now, role playing, tabletop role playing to me, or virtual tabletop role playing if you play over the internet. Um, yeah, that is 100% a valid reason against it. Um, Barbicus, again, sorry for my mispronouncing. The way I handle it is obviously players create NPCs in their backstory, um, and like I was fortunate enough that my players created quite vague NPCs. They just had, oh, thank you. Um, they just had a kind of a name and not even like a physical description or anything, just what role that they played in their backstory. So the one off the top of my head is the warlock learned how to control his magic from a halfling. I had halfling, I had her name, and I had that she knows about controlling magic. So having what I mean by creating NPCs and stuff is that kind of ambiguity. And then when it comes to things during travel scenes, so far it's, I mean, yes, if you feel something crosses a limit into kind of that you're not comfortable with, say that. But my players have been largely respectful of the chance I'm giving them to define bits of the world. So it's been more things like, I guess, the geographical equivalent of a trinket, if you're familiar with fifth edition D&D. Um, Off the top of my head, they found a man-eating plant, which was like an amusing encounter. Um, a giant skeleton. Yeah. So things that are really cool narrative fluff and kind of have a flavor a scene, flavor a short scene, but aren't hugely world defining, if that makes sense. But yeah, I 100% I play to discover the world and piece it together as well, especially as a GM. I have the framework and the locations, but other than that, just whatever I consider at the minute based on the world state as it is generally goes. Um, I'm going to end the YouTube recording, but as I say, I'm going to hang around and chat for a little bit. Um, so I hope YouTube has enjoyed this at the very least, and I'll probably be doing this again next week. But if I don't, sorry YouTube.